My name is Priya, and for 12 years, my husband's family had a very specific way of talking about me whenever they thought I couldn't hear it clearly, or sometimes even when they knew I could. Failure. Not always the exact word, but always the exact shape of it. Priya's still doing that little marketing thing. My mother-in-law would say at every gathering, in a tone that made my actual job sound like a hobby I hadn't quite grown out of yet. 12 years of that particular tone, delivered consistently enough that I'd almost stopped noticing how much it cost me every single time, until the week a merger made the business news, and every single person who'd spent 12 years calling me a failure found out, all at once, exactly whose signature had made that headline possible. I want to take you back to where this started, because you need to understand the shape of my husband's family, before you'll understand why nobody at that table ever thought twice about what they were saying in front of me. I married my husband, David, when I was 26. His family, the Whitfields, were old money adjacent in the specific way that mattered enormously to them, and almost nothing to anyone outside their circle. A family that had made real money 2 generations back in commercial real estate, and had spent the decades since mostly coasting on that inheritance while treating any career that wasn't finance, law, or medicine as something slightly beneath serious consideration. David's father, Richard, ran the family's investment holdings. David's older brother, Preston, worked at a prestigious law firm downtown. And I came into that family as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized consumer products company, a job that, to the Whitfields, sounded like exactly the kind of soft, unserious career path that explained everything they needed to know about me. The comments started early and never really stopped. At my first Whitfield family Christmas, Richard asked what I did, and when I told him, he said, "Marketing, well, someone's got to make the ads, I suppose," and turned back to a conversation about municipal bonds before I'd finished my sentence. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was subtler but somehow worse, the kind of subtle that leaves a mark precisely because you can never quite point to a single sentence and call it unfair. She'd introduce me to her friends as David's wife. She does something in advertising, letting the word something carry all the dismissal she needed without ever technically saying anything unkind. Here's the detail that matters later. I didn't tell the Whitfields much about my actual career, partly because early attempts to explain it had been met with such thin, performative interest that continuing to elaborate felt pointless, and partly because, somewhere around year 4 of the marriage, I'd made a quiet, private decision that my career didn't need their understanding to be real. I threw myself into the work instead, genuinely, deeply, the way people do when the recognition they're not getting at home makes the recognition available elsewhere feel more valuable by comparison. I moved from that first marketing coordinator role into brand strategy, then into a director-level position at a growing consumer goods company, work that increasingly involved not just marketing execution but real strategic decisions about market positioning, competitive analysis, and eventually mergers and acquisitions evaluation, since brand value turned out to be one of the central questions in nearly every deal my company considered. I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I had a genuine talent for understanding how brands actually created value, not just in the creative sense the Whitfields imagined when they pictured making the ads, but in the harder, more technical sense of quantifying what a brand was actually worth and how that value could be protected or grown through a transaction. By the time I was 34, I'd become the head of corporate strategy at a mid-sized consumer products company called Halden Brands, leading the team responsible for evaluating every major strategic decision the company made, including, increasingly, potential acquisitions and partnerships. None of this ever really landed with the Whitfields because I'd stopped years earlier, offering up the details voluntarily. When Eleanor asked at family dinners how the marketing thing was going, I'd say, "Good, busy," and let the conversation drift back to Preston's latest case or Richard's newest investment, because elaborating further had simply never once changed how much space I occupied in their understanding of who I was. 2 years ago, Halden Brands entered serious talks with a much larger consumer goods conglomerate about a potential acquisition, a deal that would eventually value our company at just under $800 million. I led the strategic evaluation from our side, working closely with our CEO and the board through 18 months of careful, exhausting negotiation, structuring the deal terms, valuing the brand portfolio, and ultimately becoming the internal executive most responsible for building the case that convinced our board the deal was the right move for the company's future, and for the roughly 400 employees whose jobs depended on getting the terms right. I didn't tell the Whitfields any of this while it was happening, partly due to genuine confidentiality obligations around a deal of that size before it became public, and partly, if I'm honest, because I'd simply stopped expecting them to care about details that large even if I had been free to share them. David knew, obviously, and was proud of me in the quiet, steady way he'd always been, though even he sometimes seemed surprised by the scale of what I was actually managing, since I'd gotten so used to compressing my professional life into small, deflecting sentences at family gatherings that I think even my own husband sometimes underestimated the full shape of it. The deal became public 4 months ago, announced first through a formal press release and then covered fairly extensively in the business press, given the size of the transaction and Halden brand's recognizable consumer presence. The coverage specifically named me, in several of the more detailed articles, as the executive who had led the strategic evaluation and negotiation process, quoting analysts who credited the deal's favorable terms, particularly the employee protection provisions I'd fought hard to include, to my specific leadership throughout the process. Eleanor, it turns out, reads the business section of the newspaper every single morning, a habit I'd genuinely never known about in 12 years of marriage, because it had simply never come up in any of our limited conversations. She called David directly, not me, the morning the story ran, and I heard about the conversation secondhand, which somehow made it land even more sharply than if I'd heard it myself. She'd apparently read the article twice, according to David, before asking him, in a tone he described as somewhere between confusion and disbelief, "Is this our Priya? The one who does the little marketing thing?" David, to his real credit, corrected her plainly, told her that the little marketing thing had over 12 years become one of the most senior strategy roles at a company now worth close to $1 billion, and that I'd personally led the negotiation that just made international business news. I appreciated that he didn't soften it for her comfort. I think, after 12 years of watching his family talk about me that way, some part of him had been waiting for exactly this moment too, even if neither of us had planned for it to arrive quite like this. The family gathering that followed about 3 weeks later, at Eleanor and Richard's house for a birthday dinner for one of David's nephews, was different from any Whitfield gathering I'd attended in 12 years. Eleanor greeted me at the door with an unfamiliar warmth, actually asking, unprompted, about the deal, about what my day-to-day work actually looked like, questions carrying a specific, careful curiosity I genuinely couldn't remember her ever extending toward me before. Richard, over dinner, brought up the merger himself, asking detailed, genuinely engaged questions about deal structure and valuation methodology, the exact kind of technical conversation he'd always reserved for Preston's legal work and his own investment decisions never once in 12 years extended toward mine. I want to be honest about how I felt sitting at that table, watching this shift happen in real time. It wasn't pure satisfaction, though there was some of that underneath everything else. Mostly, it was a kind of tired, complicated sadness, the specific sadness of realizing that the respect I'd wanted from this family for 12 years had apparently always been available, just conditional on an achievement large enough and public enough that they couldn't quite manage to dismiss it the way they'd dismissed everything smaller and quieter that came before it. I found myself wondering, sitting there answering Richard's questions, whether they'd ever go back and reconsider all the smaller achievements they'd waved away over the years, or whether this one merger would simply become the new exception that proved their old assumptions had been generally correct. I didn't say any of that out loud at dinner. I answered Richard's questions plainly, professionally, the way I would in any client meeting, and I let the evening unfold without making it into the confrontation some tired part of me might have wanted years earlier to finally have. But I did say something to Eleanor later that night, as David and I were leaving, something I'd been sitting with for the past 3 weeks since the article ran. She hugged me goodbye, warmer than she'd ever hugged me before, and said something about how proud the family was of what I'd accomplished. I told her gently but honestly, "I've been accomplishing things for 12 years, Eleanor. This one just happened to make the newspaper." She didn't have an immediate response to that. I don't think there really is one. Things have shifted since then, in careful, uneven ways I'm still adjusting to. Eleanor calls more often now, asks real questions with real follow-up attached. Questions I answer honestly even though some part of me still holds a little distance, unwilling to fully forget 12 years of the little marketing thing, simply because one headline changed the tone of the conversation. Richard has started asking my opinion on investment decisions, genuinely valuing my strategic judgment in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. And I've noticed, More than once, a specific flicker of something like retroactive embarrassment cross his face whenever the conversation touches on how long it took him to actually ask. I think about those 12 years often, all the family dinners where my actual work sat compressed into 2 dismissive words, while conversation orbited around Preston's cases and Richard's investments. And I've come to believe something about it that I don't think I fully understood until the merger made the news. Respect that only arrives once your achievement becomes too large and too public to dismiss isn't really the same thing as respect. It's closer to a correction, grudging and overdue, extended not because someone finally saw you clearly, but because the evidence became too undeniable to keep looking past. I'm grateful, genuinely, that David's family finally sees a truer picture of who I am. But I don't forget, easily, that it took a headline to make them look, when 12 years of quiet, steady, genuinely excellent work sitting right in front of them had never once been enough on its own.